Okay, I'm going to be discussing diffusion, especially as it related to the lab we did. First off, the definition of diffusion is movement of molecules from a region of greater molecular activity to regions of lesser molecular activity. Basically, the idea is that when molecules get too crowded, they get too active, they smash into each other and push each other out of the way. I usually like to think about diffusion in terms of bouncing tennis balls, where the bouncing tennis balls represent molecules moving. Suppose you have a room full of bouncing tennis balls and it's got a door leading into an empty room next to it. If you open the door, those tennis balls are eventually going to start bouncing into the empty room. It's a good analogy for diffusion. Molecules moving where there's lots of activity to where there's lesser activity. And there's a lot of different things that influence rates of diffusion. The first one is viscosity. Viscosity is resistance to flow. That is, things that are thicker. For example, something like Jello is much more viscous than water, so it flows more slowly. If viscosity is higher, diffusion is lower. So you can imagine if both of the rooms with the tennis balls were full of Jello, if you open the door between the two, the tennis balls would not bounce very easily over from one room to the next because they would be slowed down by the Jello. So increasing viscosity decreases rates of diffusion. Next thing we're going to look at is molecular weight. If the molecular weight is higher, that means that diffusion is lower. So as the molecules are heavier, they move more slowly, and therefore they diffuse less quickly. So imagine instead of having tennis balls bouncing in the room, we had a bunch of heavy bowling balls bouncing in the room. So you can imagine if you open the door, bowling balls would bounce in the other room much more slowly than tennis balls would bounce because they're much more slow. Our third concept was temperature. As temperature increases, it will increase rates of diffusion. This happens simply because as molecules are hotter, they move faster. As they're colder, they move more slowly. So if the molecules are moving more slowly, they're going to diffuse more quickly. So we can imagine if our tennis balls bouncing suddenly started bouncing a lot faster, you open the door, they'd fly in the room next to them a whole lot more quickly than they would if they were bouncing slowly. Our next concept is pressure. As pressure increases, so does rates of diffusion. So let's imagine our room with the tennis balls, and suppose our room with tennis balls suddenly got 1/4 as big, basically shrunk down a lot. Tennis balls would suddenly get a lot more crowded, therefore when you open the door between the two rooms, they would be pushed into the empty room much more quickly than if the room they were in was large. So that's a good analogy for pressure. And finally, concentration. As concentration of molecules increases, so does the rate of diffusion. So imagine we have 1,000,000 tennis balls bouncing in the room instead of a few hundred. You open the door, they would pour through the door into the empty room because there's a much higher concentration. Okay, so basically I want you to remember that diffusion is movement of molecules from a region of high molecular activity to regions of low molecular activity, because as molecules move, they force each other away. They get forced away from each other, and they get pushed toward regions where there's fewer molecules moving around. And I would like for you also to remember all the factors that influence rates of diffusion.